Welcome, EMS students. I think it's important to know a little bit about anatomy so that we can better understand what's affecting our patients. One of the first things, though, is to understand how to describe in what area we're looking at in describing potential injuries or describing where the pain originates and where it may move or radiate to. And it's important that we know about these type of anatomical planes as they will give us some direction as to where are we going to describe the pain going from. Also, the direction. So here you can see moving away from a point of origin, which would mean distal, moving towards the point of origin, which would mean proximal. Center of the body mass would be midline. Moving away from the central line or midline would be lateral or towards the patient's side. You can also see when they talk about anterior would be the frontal surface and posterior being the back surface. Under the armpit, we call it axillary line. Other regions, if we talked about the head, we're talking about the cranium. There may be different portions of the head. As you see, they're pointing towards the back here. Would be the occipital region. This would be the frontal region. On the back posterior aspect, they're looking at the cervical region of the cervical vertebrae. Here you have the thoracic vertebrae, the sway and the lumbar vertebrae. And then we have the, the sacral and coccyx that fuse together to become the pelvic girdle. And we can see other areas. They're looking at this upper part of the lower extremity here as the thigh, but this would be our lower extremity. This would be considered the upper extremity. This is the anterior surface, showing us the thoracic region, the abdominal region. Then more terms describing particularly the anatomical locations for the chest. We use the clavicle here as a marker, and it seems to be like part of the top marking. We have a diaphragmatic region just below the rib cage, delineating the abdominal cavity from the upper thoracic cage. You can see that midline here is the sternum. If we move a little laterally, we can even break the clavicle up to be mid-clavicular line. As we move towards the armpit or axillary region, this is in the front portion of that axillary region, so we call it the anterior axillary line. If we were to rotate this picture and look at the posterior or back surface, we could consider that then being the posterior axillary line. Here they're using the scapula as another region, mid-scapulary line, and then this would be a mid spinal line, and then just on the side of it is paraspinal line. The spinous process here would delineate your cervical vertebrae and then moving down into the upper thoracic vertebrae. Again, here you're seeing the axillary line. Posterior axillary line is just behind that armpit area, and just anterior axillary line is toward the front of the armpit area. And a few more anatomical regions. As we break down the human body, its different cavities would house different organs. We'll talk about these so shortly. Then the cranium, the orbits of the eye, the upper cheekbones or maxilla, the lower jawbone on the mandible. Temporomandible joint is where the cranium and the lower jaw bone, the mandible, meet together. Again, the clavicle surface, the upper bone is the humerus, radial is the thumb side, ulnar is the underside of that arm. We have the larger femur bone that's laying in here, the round, flat patella or kneecap. And then to the front bone would be our tibia, and further back would be the fibular bone. And we have the ankle bone made up of the malleolus. Here they're showing you a takeaway section where we can see internal organs such as the larynx, which is part of the windpipe. It'll break off into the right and left mainstem bronchus. And then we see the lungs here, the liver, the stomach, the intestines, the bladder. What we're not seeing is the retroperitoneal area of the kidneys, which they lay in the back. Potential spaces and cavities. The cranial vault itself houses the brain, spinal cord, and blood supply to the brain, and it can only house that much. And within the spinal cord itself is the spinous the processes that run down is the spinal cord. This would be the central nervous system, as the nerves are contained within this column and the cranial vault. Thoracic cavity, which houses the lungs, the heart and great vessels, and part of the esophagus. Diaphragm delineates the upper thoracic cage from the abdominal cavity. The abdominal cavity houses all the internal organs such as the stomach, pancreas, liver, gallbladder, spleen, small intestines, large intestines, and in the posterior aspect of this abdominal cavity is the retroperitoneal, where we house the kidneys, the ureters. And as the pelvic girdle delineates the lower area of the abdominal cavity and then transition to the pelvic cavity, we may house the bladder and then organs of reproduction. Here again is an overlay of the abdominal organs within the abdominal cavity. The liver up in the right upper quadrant, as it is on the right upper quadrant. The gallbladder that houses bile travels through the common bile duct across to the pancreas and then down into the small intestine. Here you can see that the stomach mainly is on the left upper quadrant, but again then there's also the spleen that lives here. We can see that the colon, the large transverse colon, is housed in the upper, both right and left upper quadrant, but it does start and ascend from the right lower quadrant. And then it descends here as it passes the material that turns into fecal material out through the descending colon that starts up here in the upper left and then to the lower left quadrant. Other things that are also housed in these areas are noted here. The skeletal system is basically bones, cartilages, and ligaments and joints. They protect, support the body. They provide a framework for muscles that are used in movement. They also help to form some blood cells that are within the bone, hematopoiesis, in the bone marrow cavities. It also stores these minerals caused like calcium and phosphate. Part of those bones and the skeletal system make up the cranium. And here you can see the temporomandible joint. This is the lower mandible, maxilla, the frontal bone. Here's some sutures that then fuse. Here's your parietal bone, the temporal bone here, and occipital bone. We continue on with the axial skeleton. Here you can see it's part of the cranium and then the spinal cord itself. As you can see on posterior view, you can see the scapular bones, the rib cage, thoracic cage here, the ribs and the thoracic vertebrae, cervical vertebrae, thoracic vertebrae. As those lower ribs attach and leave, then we get the sway and the lumbar vertebrae, the sacrum that's fused and part of our pelvic girdle, and then the coccygeal bone. And also with the muscular system, there's also parts of the joints that allow for mobility. Here we have fused joints, slightly movable joints, and then freely movable joints that allow for mobility. Within these joints, there would be a capsule here to allow frictionless movement in which there's synovial fluid. Within the bone, there is a matrix of which there's blood vessels. This allows this bone to develop and harden over and expand and harden over time. The muscular system attaches itself to the bony skeleton and transforms the chemical energy such as ATP into mechanical energy. It results in our movement, expression, posturing, and when we shiver, we can generate body heat. This is where the muscles are moving. There are three types of muscles. Skeletal muscle, which is attached to the bones. Cardiac muscle, which controls the for the heart muscle itself, so it contracts. And then smooth muscle, which is found in hollow organs such as the stomach, bladder, and respiratory passageways. Here they're showing you the muscular layer of our blood vessels. And in a normal blood vessel, the muscular layer is keeps the lumen at a normal size. And here we have vasoconstriction, where that smooth muscle there constricted down, closing off or narrowing the lumen, allowing the blood pressure or blood volume to maintain itself. And here we have some dilation of that muscle, where that muscle is totally relaxed, allowing the lumen to open. So we understand a little bit about vasoconstriction and vasodilation. The respiratory system, components of the nasal cavity, the pharynx, the larynx, the windpipe or trachea, and then the lungs. Lungs are broken down to the bronchi, right and left. And then there's some other segments and tertiary airways that continue to conduct air and oxygen and carbon dioxide. Goes down to the bronchioles, and then terminal airway called the alveoli, where we have this oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange through the walls of air sacs of the alveoli. Here we see the upper airway zones and components. Again, the lungs are used for breathing, where air moves in and out. It travels down through the large passageway into the lungs. We have 3 lobes on the right, 2 lobes on the left, and in the center here, this mediastinal space leaves area for the cardiac muscle and cardiac silhouette. It's important that we understand that air exchange is a result of breathing. This is both internal and external respiration that goes on. So external respiration is the contact of outside or atmospheric air entering into the lungs. Internal respiration is where that gas exchange occurs at the alveoli, and the red blood cell then is able to take that oxygen and pass it on to the cells that make up either tissues, organs, organ systems. They're looking at now the terminal airway, or the bronchiole that meets up to the alveoli, the terminal airway. Here we have a normal bronchiole. The smooth muscle here around it has not contracted, allows this lumen, this airway passageway, to remain open. And here we see this tightening of this smooth muscle here around this bronchiole, causing bronchial constriction. And you can see it as the lumen there narrows. And this could be a problem with breathing, as air is not able to exchange through that area. There is a lining that lines the visceral and parietal regions. Visceral would be the organ itself. Parietal would be along the rib cage. This line is adhered quite thickly to keep the lung expanded. Here we have the mediastinal space and an area for the cardiac muscle, cardiac silhouette, and here's the diaphragmatic region, that muscular, the primary muscle mover. Some anatomical differences between the adult and pediatric patient. Here you can see that the airway is slightly compromised or kinked because of the larger occipital protuberance of the pediatric airway. Versus the adult airway, we can see that the trachea is quite straight here. You can also note that the tongue in the oral cavity is much larger per se than the opening here. That can cause some obstruction. That's an anatomical obstruction again. And here we have a different view of the tongue and the open space here to allow air to pass down through this semi-cartilaginous rings of the trachea. Mechanics of respiration: air comes in and the lungs expand, as well as the chest wall or thoracic cage, diaphragm contracts and goes down. Here another diagram is showing where the diaphragm contracts, air is expelled, and the person is able to exhale. The alveoli here is showing us that when oxygenated blood gets its oxygen, it does come through the alveoli through a capillary, through the venial, and then this exchange is done through this soft, thin membrane where it allows the gas exchange for oxygen for carbon dioxide, and then blood then returns through the red blood cells out to the body. Here's external respiration. Here we have the transfer of blood. Now it goes on to internal respiration. Here's just another diagram of how this gas is exchanged through this permeable membrane for just this gases to occur, and the red blood cells picking up the oxygen and then delivering carbon dioxide to be exhaled. Circulatory system includes the blood vessels, that includes the arteries, arterioles, veins, venules, capillaries. It also includes the myocardium, which is the heart or heart muscle, and then the blood that flows through this system. The heart is made of 4 chambers. We have 2 upper chambers called the atria, both the right and the left. The right atria receives blood through the vena cava. We have 2 lower chambers called the ventricles, both the right and the left. And then as the blood returns from the vena cava to the right atrium, it then empties into the right ventricle. The right ventricle takes that unoxygenated blood and pumps it out through the pulmonary artery. It goes out to the lungs to have the gas exchange, and then it returns here to these pulmonary veins into the left atrium. You can see that it's coming from both sides of the lungs, returning to the left atrium, empties into the left ventricle, and then is expelled out from the left ventricle through the aorta. The heart has a special function as it has a conduction system where it conducts and starts impulses. These impulses are generated from the SA node. They carry over through the atrial pathways, then through the AV node where there's a slight pause to allow the atria to empty into the ventricles. Once they do that, that slight millisecond of impulse being held at the AV node, it continues down through this bundle of His where the ventricular fibers here, these bundle branches, then bundle together. Impulses continue down to the right and left bundle branches and out through the Purkinje fibers, causing the heart to contract. Here we see blood supplied to the heart muscle, myocardium. This is the coronary artery. They are housed at the base of the aorta. That's where the blood flow starts, and it goes out to the right coronary artery here, and then the left coronary artery. Blood returns back to the venous system of the myocardium and empties into the coronary sinus back in the right atrium. Here's a look at our blood vessels, arteries, which have quite a lot of smooth muscle here, so they can constrict when we need them to shunt the blood to the body system. Here you have veins, which have very little muscle here, but are return blood based on a valve type system. And then the capillary, which is very thin walled, which allows the gases and nutrients then to expand through that. And if the capillaries become porous or leaky, we can also have some fluid shifts and loss there. Here they're showing you how blood, as the pressure is higher in the arterial side or artery side, as it crosses over to the capillary, water may be forced out, and then water may be reabsorbed later. But here we have the exchange of blood going out to cells and then returning back in, as it's a lower oxygenated content from the capillary bed to the venule and back to the vein. So the circulatory system is important for this oxygenation, circulation, and perfusion of, again, oxygen and nutrients to the organs. And this is carried out through this circulatory system. The nervous system Its components of the brain, spinal cord, and nerves, and our sensory receptors. It does have this faster acting control and communicates this signaling system throughout the body. Nervous system cells communicate via rapid, specific electrical signals. And millions of sensory receptors are out there carrying information from the outside of the body back into the central nervous system. The central nervous system comprises of the brain and the spinal cord. And we have a peripheral nervous system as it goes out to the motor neurons here. As you can see, this picture diagram here depicts somebody sensing that there's heat. As a result of that impulse going back, that sensory impulse going back, it causes a motor reflex to remove that limb, that hand and arm away from that heat. Nervous system is then also breaks down into a autonomic nervous system, which splits into sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So it's important to know that our sympathetic nervous system is regarded on the fight and flight, which will cause constriction of blood vessels, increase in our heart rate, will cause our lungs to expand and our bronchioles to dilate so that we can perform vigorous type of work. On the opposite side, it slows everything down through the parasympathetic nervous system, and everything returns back to normal. We would consider this to be what we say feed and breathe or rest state. So it may slow down the heart rate, allow for digestion. Now the specific chemical that causes the fight or flight symptoms or ability is called adrenaline. Adrenaline comes from the adrenal gland, and it's basically epinephrine or norepinephrine. So epinephrine is both an alpha and beta stimulant. Norepinephrine is mostly alpha, and so your beta stimulants increase beta 1. Beta 1 is your heart, and beta 2 is your lungs. It causes increased heart rate by beta 1. It causes increased breathing and bronchodilation, beta 2. Your alpha stimulation through epinephrine and norepinephrine causes vasoconstriction, the constriction and narrowing of your arteries so that we can maintain blood pressure. On the parasympathetic side, the chemical here is acetylcholine. Here we're showing the endocrine system. The endocrine system is a glandular system, pituitary thyroids, our parathyroids, adrenals, penile thymus, pancreas, and then the reproductive organs such as the gonads, the ovaries, and testes. They secrete hormones that then will then attack or affect other target organs. It may help in reproduction, mobilization, defense of stress, maintenance of electrolyte, water, and nutrient balance, and help with stimulation of growth and metabolism. The skin or the integumentary system is important as it's the first line of defense. It's comprised of the skin, hair, nails, sweat glands, oil glands. Again, it protects the deeper tissues and organs from injury. It's the external barrier. It helps to regulate body temperature, excretes waste products such as salt and urea. It helps with synthesizing certain chemicals such as vitamin D so that we can have some bone development. Again, it's also for sensory receptors for pain, pressure, and temperature. The digestive system is important for digestion. So we start off with the mouth, which breaks down large particles of food and nutrients into smaller particles. It goes down through the pharynx, and we bolus this swallow or bolus of food, then continues down through the esophagus and into the stomach. In the stomach, the pH content is very high, and we have more breakdown of the digestive products. Small intestines are responsible for some of that reabsorption of nutrients. Whatever leftover products continue to the large intestines. This is the colon, ascending, transverse, and descending colon. Reabsorption of water occurs, and the material of digestions and that waste becomes fecal matter. The urinary system comprises itself of the kidneys, the ureter, the bladder, and the urethra. The kidneys an important function uh, to rid the body of excess fluid and to help filter out some of the system. However, it also is important in production in the adrenal gland that sits on top of the kidney. We also use uh, the kidney to secrete certain chemicals such as renin to also aid with the circulation and blood pressure. So urine then collects through these ducts, passes through the ureters down into the bladder, and as the bladder swells, it contracts, and then the waste products, such in the urine, is then expelled through the urethra. Our last two components, thank you for sticking in with us. We have the male and female reproductive systems. Again, the testes, uh, epididymis, vas deferens, the seminal vesicles, prostate gland, bulbourethral gland, and then the penis. Where basically the male sex cell is the spermatocyte. The female reproductive organs are the mammary glands, the uterus, the fallopian tubes, the ovaries, in which the ovaries develop the oocyte. So the female sex cell is the oocyte. Fertilization occurs somewhere down in the fallopian tube, and it's implanted in the uterus, and the outer area, the external area of the female reproductive area is called the vulva. This is the outer vaginal area, but you can quite see here where the uterus and the cervix make up part of how it exits through the external labia or genitalia. I hope this helps in a review of your human anatomy and body systems.